James Avery Ruble passed away on December 22nd, 1976, in Sullivan, Missouri, at the age of 73 years old. He is survived by his wife, Myrtle Lewis Ruble, two children, Jim Ruble and wife Irene of Sullivan, and Helen Brown of Sullivan, five grandchildren, Stanley Dalkey, Wayne Brown, Alan Ruble, Beverly Ruble, and Sandy Ruble. Funeral services were held in Vulcan, Missouri. He was buried in Sutton Cemetery, also located in Vulcan, Missouri. The Rubles immigrated from Bavaria, located in southern Germany, in 1742. They settled in York, Pennsylvania. They eventually moved to Tennessee, and in 1823, Joseph Ruble moved to Missouri. Here, he settled the area that would become Vulcan, located in southern Iron County. In this video taken at Sutton Cemetery, Jim Ruble, Avery's son, explains the lineage.
This is Henry Ruble, the son of Joseph and Stacy McCrae Ruble, and Joseph is the one that settled Vulcan in 1823, and Henry is his son, so he would be our great-great-grandfather. And then we'll go on down to the next one, but Henry is the oldest one that's buried up here, and Joseph is buried down behind Cubby Ruble's house on down to Vulcan, because that's the original homestead. And so Joseph came here in 1823 and settled Vulcan. This is William Ruble, the son of Henry Ruble, and he's the second oldest in this cemetery, and he's our great-grandfather. And his wife Hepsy is buried next to him with a small stone there. And William lived in the Vulcan area. Okay, this is James Andrew and Nellie McCormick Ruble, and that's William's son. And James Andrew is my grandpa. So we've got James Andrew, we got William, and then we got Henry, and then, like I said, Joseph is buried down by Cubby Rubles. Okay,
go on, and the next one down here.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
This is James Avery and Myrtle Lewis Ruble. And James Avery is my dad and the son of William Ruble.
James Andrew.
James Andrew. And they lived at Vulcan, and they were raised their family at Vulcan, and they lived at Bruno for several years.
I'm James Adrian Ruble. This video is about my dad, James Avery Ruble. My dad was born in Vulcan, Missouri on November the 29th, 1903, and his mom and dad were James Andrew Ruble and Lucy Nellie Jane McCormick Ruble. They lived on a farm just a little bit south of Vulcan, Missouri, and that's where my dad was raised. And when in later years, my dad was always called Avery from the time he was born, his middle name. And when he got grandkids, the grandkids started calling him Paul, P.A., Paul. And it wasn't long until everybody called him Paul, and even though he passed away several years ago, everybody still refers to him as Paul. Very seldom anybody ever calls him Avery. In 1909, when my dad was 6 years old, there was a typhoid or scarlet fever epidemic. His 4-year-old brother, William Elmer, and his 1-year-old sister, Avis Irene, died from the disease. My dad survived the fever, but it settled in his right lower leg and his ears. Periodically, for the rest of his life, his right leg between the knee and the ankle would swell and would hurt. And he had nerve deafness in his ears, especially in his right ear, and eventually got very hard of hearing. Hearing aids did not work for him because it was nerve deafness. He was very hard hearing when he died at the age of 73 in 1976. Also, Grandma Nellie Ruble, my dad's mom, gave birth to a stillborn baby in July 27th, 1910, and it was always assumed that it probably had something to do with that scarlet fever or typhoid epidemic.
My dad, Avery Ruble, was born in 1903, and he had a brother and a sister and an infant brother, and they all died of scarlet fever. And Avery, my dad, was the only one that survived, and they were, this is Avis, Irene, and this is Elmer, and this is the infant that was, and I think she was born dead.
Avery would eventually have more siblings. In this picture, left to right, Hollis, Glenn, Hazel, Owen, and Avery. These children were all born in the next several years. They all were raised on the Ruble farm located in Vulcan, Missouri.
My dad was born and grew up on the Ruble farm between Vulcan and Des Arc. He and his brothers would jump on the train going toward Vulcan. The train had just went over Gadd's Hill, pulled up Gadd's Hill, so it was going real slow or slower, and they would ride the train toward Vulcan, and when it started going too fast, they'd jump off and then walk the rest of the way to Vulcan. It was kind of dangerous, but it was a lot better than walking. My dad was a smart man. He graduated from Vulcan, Missouri school from the 8th grade, and he went to school in Ironton, Missouri, which was the county seat of Iron County. And I don't know what school he went to or what kind of school, but he went there for a while, and he had good handwriting, knew arithmetic, English, history, geography, agriculture, and he had a very good education. He passed the Missouri State Teachers Examination, and I have all his papers, his test results and everything, and he taught school 1 year at Vulcan, Missouri, and 1 year at the Blue School, which is out on the upper Crane Pond, which is near Ironton, Missouri.
Avery married Myrtle Lewis on February 8, 1927. They were married in Ironton, Missouri by the Justice of the Peace. They first lived on the Ruble farm in Vulcan. Then the Rubles bought a tract of timber on the St. Francis River and moved the sawmill there. At this time, they sold the farm and the entire family moved to Bruno. This was closer to the new mill location. Avery's parents lived in Bruno for many years.
Logging, sawmills, lumber, railroad ties was the primary industry of southern Iron County. In 1927, my dad bought a brand new 1927 Chevrolet truck. He hauled lumber from my grandpa, Jim Ruble, James Andrew Ruble's sawmill on San Francisco River to Des Arc. Logs, lumber, railroad ties, mine props lined both sides of the railroad tracks in both towns, Annapolis and Des Arc and Balkan. When he was hauling this lumber from the sawmill to Des Arc with this new 27 Chevrolet truck, if anybody that is familiar with Iron County or that area down there knows that when you go to a river, you go down the hill, either in any direction, you go downhill to get to the river. So the sawmills were usually pretty close to the river, and when they hauled the lumber from the mill to Des Arc, they had to go up a big hill to start with. And my dad said that they would load the truck with lumber, and then they would go to the bottom of the hill, going to the bottom of the hill starting up, and they would unload half the lumber and go up the hill, because the truck wouldn't haul a full load, it'd haul a half a load. And they would go up the hill, and then they would stop on top of the hill and put the other half a load that they'd left the day before or the trip before, and put it on the truck and make a full load and take it into Des Arc. And then, of course, the return trip was no problem. My dad was a miner for a few days. He worked a few shifts at the Lead Anna lead mine in Annapolis, Missouri. He said it wasn't worth working because of safety. He said one night they came out of the drift to eat lunch. When they returned to work, the whole back, which is the roof, had fell in. He quit after that. A tornado hit Annapolis in 1925 and destroyed the mine, and it never did really open too much after that, but they worked for several years there. My dad liked to fish. We would go fishing often. At least 2 times a year we would camp out at the springs off Funk Branch. The spring branch ran into a bluff, into the river at a bluff. One of his favorite baits was the small frogs just after the tadpoles lost their tail. He used an old level wind reel, and it was one of the first rods and reels in Des Arc. He caught lots of fish with that reel. Alan has that reel today.
The Rubles ran a sawmill for many years. Then the Depression hit Iron County in 1929. There was no market for the lumber, so they sold the sawmill. Avery and Myrtle moved to Annapolis. Myrtle's brother Henry had a corn crib that Avery fixed up for them to live in. They rented the corn crib from Henry for $3 a month. They had no money, so Avery worked a couple of days a month for Henry for the rent. No one had a job. Avery would pick up work here and there, but times were hard. Helen was born in 1931. They barely survived on what they could grow and hunt. After about 4 years, Avery got the contract to run the mail route. They moved to Sutton Hollow. Things got better. Jim was born in Sutton Hollow in 1935.
For several years, he carried rural mail from Annapolis post office. He had a Model A Ford coupe. I remember it real well. I would go with him practically every day that I could just to get to sit in his lap and drive the car. He ran the route through Minimum, Saco, and Dug Hill 6 days a week. And periodically, he would back the Model A into the garage that he built in Annapolis. And he would back the car in there, and he would give the car a ring job, replace the piston rings, grind the valves, and plane the head if necessary. I wasn't old enough to really help, but I'm sure I watched and probably got in the way an awful lot. But that was my first experience with cars. The mail route was a bid job, and he lost the bid in about 1944 or 45, and he sold the Model A coupe to the new mail carrier. In 1945, he went to work for the Missouri Conservation Commission Forestry Department as the Vulcan, Missouri towerman. I was 10 years old, and the tower was a wood tower with a ladder straight up the front side of the 60-foot wood tower. Later on, they put steps inside the tower going up, but when they first started, there was a ladder right straight up the front side of the tower. When we built the road to the Vulcan lookout tower, when he first started to work at the Vulcan lookout tower, it was more or less just a trail from the Funk Branch Road up to the tower. So they built a new road, and my dad's job was to drill and shoot the rock with a jackhammer and dynamite. He had a compressor and a regular old jackhammer, and they'd drill holes in the rock and then use dynamite and shoot it so they could build a road, because in that area there was a lot of granite and a lot of rock. When they built the road to the Tom Salk Tower, my dad got the job again of drilling and shooting the rock, and that was a lot of hard work with a jackhammer. Most people have never, younger people have never seen a real jackhammer, but they are hard to hold, and it's a very hard job. And there was a lot of granite on Tom Salk Mountain, so they had to shoot an awful lot of rock. And while he was working on that Tom Salk Road job, he got me a job of driving a truck on the construction job. I was 16 years old, and that would not happen today. A 16-year-old, I just got my driver's license, and I drove a truck, a Ford 47 Ford truck, all summer on that job, and we lived at Vulcan Tower. So my dad drove the Jeep. He was doing the shooting rock, and so I rode with him to the job in the Jeep. So I got free transportation and had a job all summer. My first real job.
I'm Jim Ruble. My dad, Avery Ruble, was the Vulcan towerman from 1945 to 1955. And the tower is just in front of me here, and it's still here, but it's not climbable anymore. But in 1949, the Conservation Commission built a new house here at the tower, and we lived in Annapolis. We moved out here in 1949. The house was just behind me, and just a little bit to my right was a double garage, and behind that was an outhouse, a toilet, and to the right of that back was a chicken house, and to the left of that, back a little bit more, was the barn. So we had a barn, chicken house, and car shed, and the house. And I graduated from high school in 1953, and we lived here at that time. And then in 1955, my dad moved to Sullivan because his eyes and ears started to bother him. But this is where I grew up. I tell people I was raised here with a broom rake in my hand, and that's literally what it was. We moved out here when I graduated from the 8th grade, and lived here until I graduated from high school. But this is the Vulcan Tower site. This is the metal tower at Vulcan Tower site. When my dad went to work for the commission in 1945, this was a wood tower, and the poles were like telephone poles, and with boards in between, and had a cab on it. And then sometime later, they replaced that wood tower with this metal tower. So this is the new tower. But when my dad went to work for them in 1945, it was a wood tower, and there was a ladder right straight up the front here of the tower. That was the access. And then later on, they put steps like they have now in the wooden tower. But I used to climb up that ladder right straight up to the side of the tower. And all the time I was in high school, we lived here at the house at the tower, and I'd walk down this road a mile and a quarter to catch a school bus, and I graduated high school in Annapolis in 1953.
He worked at the Vulcan Tower from 1945 to 1955. His eyes and ears started bothering him, especially during fire season, and the towermen and the crews were out practically day and night on fires, and started bothering his ears and his eyes. And in 1955, he was transferred to the Merrimack State Nursery in the Merrimack State Park in Sullivan. They lived in a native rock house in the park. The nursery work was a lot better than, a lot easier than the firefighting and the other work that the towermen had to do.
Avery and Myrtle moved to Sullivan, Missouri. They moved into a large native stone house located in Merrimack State Park. Avery's job was to work at a nursery. This nursery was located in Merrimack State Park and raised multiflora rose for seed. They picked the seed and distributed it throughout the state. They had the idea that multiflora rose could be used as erosion control and a living fence row. This ended up being an issue as the birds ate the seed and distributed it throughout the state. Eventually the nursery closed, and Avery moved to the Conservation Department headquarters located in Sullivan.
My dad was a conservationist. He was a good employee of the Conservation Commission. He worked hard at his job. He took good care of his equipment and the commission houses that he lived in for years. He taught his grandkids about nature and the forest. The grandkids said he knew every tree and plant in the forest. In 1994, his grandson, my son, Alan, wrote to the director of the Conservation Commission telling him his grandpa deserved to be recognized for his years of service. To make a long story short, the horse trail with the trailhead at the site of the native rock house in the Merrimack State Park where they lived was named the J. Avery Ruble Memorial Bridle Trail as a permanent tribute to my dad's years of service and to commemorate him.
I am blessed to have Avery Ruble as my grandfather. Pa, as we called him, was a kind and caring man. My aunt and 2 cousins live with them in the native stone house in Merrimack State Park. My cousins were my age, and we were fortunate to have hundreds of acres of forest along the Merrimack River as our playground. From the house to the south was the Pines. This was a large acreage of pine trees planted in the 1930s by the CCC as a reforestation project. The trees were tall and the forest floor covered pine needles, a magical place. To the west was the Merrimack River. We spent many days at the river and along its bluffs. To the north was Silver Hollow. There were several caves in this hollow where we explored on a regular basis. Pa would take us on many adventures, especially after he retired. We would all 4 pile into his truck and take off. We went with him to cut wood in Silver Hollow. The stone house had only wood heat, so he burned a lot of wood. We would roam the woods while he cut with the chainsaw and then help him load the truck. He would cut grapevines for us to swing on. Silver Hollow ran into the Merrimack, and that's where the pawpaw trees grew. He knew where they were and when to pick them. They are native to Missouri and taste like bananas. We went fishing often, sometimes on the Merrimack at Five Bottom. Occasionally we would camp there and fish all night. He sure knew how to cook a great breakfast over a campfire. We also fished at the nursery pond. This was the old irrigation pond at the nursery in the park. We caught bass and bluegill in the pond and giant crawfish below the spillway. And of course, anything we caught we brought home to Dee Dee for her to cook. One fall we picked dogwood seed. The commission was paying by the pound for wild dogwood seed. He sold the seed and gave us the money. One day he taught us how to saw logs with a 2-man crosscut saw, passing on the old ways from his many years in the timber business. The time I spent with him greatly influenced who I am today. I still enjoy hunting, fishing, and spending time in the woods. For me, his spirit still lives in the forest of Missouri. I visit him every time I take a walk in the woods.